Next Sunday, BBC One begins a spectacular production of The Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. And as a preview to the series, Humphrey Carpenter describes how it came to be written as he guides us past watchful dragons.
Can we just describe the action for Perry, please? Could I have a little hush?
Hush, everyone.
Quiet, everywhere.
Nice and quiet. Smile the lights, everyone. Very quiet.
Here comes the play.
Can you run up to record, please, George?
We're up to speak, Griff.
We are recording. Nice and quiet.
Stand by!
Smoke up, Steve.
Action. Cue, Leslie.
You, Leslie.
Cue, Mr. Beaver.
But now that Aslan is on the move.
Do it from please start again.
Try one more.
Here we go again.
Because it's wide shot.
Let's try it with all the heads on it. Beaver's heads off.
Come to me, evil! All who's evil works for me! Nya! Nya! Nya!
The naked beaver.
That's all right. I think we'll just give them a break.
Say!
Roast beef.
I couldn't eat another thing.
Gosh, what a lovely meal.
Stop recording.
You Hold it there. Stop recording. Stop recording.
Well, if you're wondering what all that was about, you can find out next Sunday by watching the first episode of C.S. Lewis's famous fantasy, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. It's one of the 7 Narnia books for children that he wrote in the late 1940s and early 1950s when he was teaching here at Magdalen College, Oxford. Narnia is C.S. Lewis's magical world, a bit like Alice's Wonderland, lived in by talking animals like Mr. and Mrs. Beaver and Mr. Tumnus the Fawn.
Excuse me,
Goodness gracious me.
are you a fawn?
In Narnia, it's permanently winter because it's ruled by a wicked queen in the shape of the White Witch on her sleigh.
And what, pray, are you?
She has a rival, a lion with deep magical power to bring about miraculous transformations. C.S. Lewis was one of the most popular writers this century, and not just for children. As well as the 7 Narnia stories, he wrote books about literature and about the world we live in and whether there might be other worlds before or after it. He was born in Belfast in the north of Ireland in November 1898. As a boy, his closest friend was his elder brother, Warren. When he was only 8, his mother died tragically of cancer. It took the 2 boys and their father years to recover from this shattering blow. Young Lewis, or Jack as he called himself, was a great reader even then. He especially liked the Beatrix Potter stories, and Squirrel Nutkin was his favourite character.
I liked the Beatrix Potter illustrations at a time when the idea of humanized animals fascinated me perhaps even more than it fascinates most children.
He liked the animal cartoons by the artist Tenniel in Punch magazine, and reading stories about the Knights of the Round Table and the court of King Arthur. He started writing and illustrating animal fantasy stories of his own, all set in the make-believe world of Animal Land. And when his brother came home from boarding school, the 2 of them got together and drew elaborate maps of a whole imaginary continent they called Boxen. The Boxen stories are a kind of simplified version of the more magical land of Narnia he created nearly 40 years later. When he was sent away to a private tutor, he found he could read as many fantasies and legends as he liked, such as Arthur Rackham's editions of German myths and medieval stories like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And when he learned Latin and Greek, he tackled Homer's great poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey. His tutor, Mr. Kirkpatrick, said he's read more classics than any boy I ever had. That's how Jack Lewis came here to Oxford as a student. He got first-class honours in 3 subjects. He became a don, a teacher in the university, and he was soon an expert in the sort of medieval and mythological literature that he loved. But all the time he was teaching here, he was hatching his own fantasy stories. People won't write the kind of books I want, he said, so I'll have to do it myself. The outbreak of war in 1939 gave Lewis a setting for these stories. thousands of children were evacuated, sent out from the big cities to keep them safe from bombing. And when 4 evacuee schoolgirls arrived at Lewis's home in Oxford, he started the first version of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe.
This book is about 4 children whose names were Anne, Martin, Rose and Peter. But it is most about Peter, who was the youngest. They all had to go away from London suddenly because of air raids. They were sent to stay with a kind of relation of mother's who was a very old professor who lived all by himself in the country.
That's how they found themselves in another world, Narnia. With the right sound effects, it's fairly easy to bring the Narnia stories alive on radio.
Oh, here they come again. Where now?
Let's get into the wardroom until they've passed. No one will follow us in here.
Want a bed?
Do be quiet, everyone.
See?
Quick, there's nowhere else. Into the wardrobe.
You can do whatever you like with animation, and so it's not surprising that there's an American, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe cartoon. But trying to recreate Narnia with live actors on television is much more difficult, though the independent ABC company did a remarkably good job in 1968. The writer who adapted that ITV production was Trevor Preston. Did he think it was an ambitious thing to do at the time?
It was meant to be a sort of storyteller to camera to some extent. And then the production team said, well, we could illustrate that a little bit, couldn't we? And then it grew and grew and grew and grew. And I suppose in terms of children's drama then, yes, it was ambitious.
21 years later, the BBC has been able to give the writer of this latest adaptation, Alan Seymour, far more resources to play with.
The great joy of being a writer, of course, is the freedom you have writing something like this. You just sit there and you put down the words on the page, conjure up the most incredibly difficult and complicated effects, and you know that you don't have to solve that problem. You're setting a problem for producer, director, or the effects departments to cope with later on.
So it's still an ambitious project today, and a costly one too, as producer Paul Stone explains.
Well, obviously, as it will be apparent, it's an expensive programme. But in order to make this kind of programme, you really got to have backing of either an independent co-producer or, unfortunately in this case, we are being partly financed by BBC Enterprises.
Pamela Lonsdale, who produced the ABC version, wasn't quite so well off.
Well, originally it was on a very low budget because it was to be just a Jackanory type presentation with really only a small set and a few pictures. We increased the budget and increased the budget, and I think we ended up at the sort of princely sum of something like £1,000 or £1,200 an episode. That was quite a lot then. I mean, now, I doubt if it'd pay for a costume.
In his final version, Lewis called the characters Peter, Susan, Edmund and Lucy. Auditions were last November.
Right. The first thing we're going to do is warm up a bit, because I'm sure you're all sitting there feeling very anxious and nervous and worried and butterflies in the tummy and...
When Richard Dempsey, Sophie Cook, Jonathan Scott and Sophie Wilcox got the parts, they soon found themselves in Narnia, or rather somewhere in the Cairngorms, outside Aviemore in Scotland in February. Miles from the nearest town, a long drive up a single-track road in filthy weather on the edge of a frozen loch. BBC Scenic Construction had already spent 3 weeks there building Mr. and Mrs. Beaver's house.
Well, all 4 children have now arrived in Narnia together. They've met up with Mr. Beaver, who is a messenger from Mr. Tumnus, and he has promised to take them home with him to have some dinner, which, as they're feeling rather hungry, is obviously very exciting for them.
Ah, here we are. And it looks as though Mrs. Beaver is expecting us.
The script actually says they arrive at the dam. Below the dam is more ice, but this has been frozen into foamy, wavy shapes. And most magnificent of all, where the water has fallen over the dam, there is a glittering